At this time, we ask that you please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices for the duration of the event. Also, please note that photography and audio and video recording are strictly prohibited in the theater. Thank you for your cooperation and enjoy the show.
Let me just have a few more general announcements regarding this evening's program. To avoid any accidents, we ask you that you please keep your books to yourselves and don't put them on the floor or in the aisles. Don't put the bags in the aisles. We don't want anyone to trip. We also want to mention that all the copies have been signed by Pete Townshend. A special thanks to Pete. And there will not be a live signing. For the Q&A portion of the program, if you are selected, we ask you that you please wait in your seat and a wireless microphone will be passed to you. We now invite you to sit back and relax and enjoy Who I Am, an interview and performance with Pete Townshend. And to begin this evening, we are going to introduce to you Professor Jeff Dornfeld, who is a professor of music business here at Berklee.
Good evening and welcome. I want to thank the Berklee College of Music bookstore for sponsoring this great event. I am so honored to introduce Pete Townshend, whose music changed my life and is the reason why I'm standing here today. I'm Jeff Dornfeld, and I'm part of the Music Business Management program at Berklee College of Music. There are moments in our life that change us forever. All my students already know this. For me, that time was June 16, 1967, Fillmore Auditorium, San Francisco, California. It was The Who's first tour in the U.S., and 2 days before they played the historic Monterey Pop Festival. The Who took the stage, and right from the start, the band moved me at an energy level that I've never seen again. Pete Townshend's songs are made for live shows, and his performance that night kept me glued to the stage. I went back the following day to see them again, and subsequently attended every San Francisco show they did. Yep, I was at the Cow Palace in 1973 when Keith Moon couldn't finish the set and the band used a drummer from the audience. I stand here today because of Pete Townshend and The Who. That day in 1967 at the Fillmore Auditorium, I was a fledgling college student with no idea what direction I wanted to take. After that show, I realized I needed to work in the music business. Since then, I've enjoyed every working day of my life. I'm here to introduce Pete Townshend, also to thank him for turning me on to music like no other artist ever did. Please give a warm welcome to the legendary Pete Townshend and interviewer Ken Zambia.
So, I'm tempted to do a Robbie Williams. Do you know what that is?
Explain it, please.
You spin the mic. This is not going to go well.
So I understand you've written a book.
Yeah.
When you signed the contract to write the book in 1996, what was your next move?
This is a different contract. I wanted to write this book originally, the thesis of the book about the way that music changed from my father's era. My father was a dance band musician, to the era that I worked and performed in, which is post-1960, 61, British rock music, as it became known as. Started as pop music, really, like any other. That the songs that needed to be sung had a different function. That's what I realized when I was 19, 20. The songs of my father's era were about post-war rebuilding, you know, hope, the hope that people would find happiness and love, and that there would be no more war, and the songs that we needed as young men after that period were songs that would allow us to survive being told that there would be no future because of the bomb, the nuclear bomb. So that's what I wanted to look at when I was 20, and I began writing the book. In 1995, I did a deal with Little Brown. My editor there was Michael Peach. I talk about him in the book, and I started to write that thesis. I came to New York, spoke to him, he said, "Pete, there's no sex and drugs and rock and roll." And I said, well, that's not what kind of book I want to write, and I'm not sure I've done that anyway. And if I did do it, I'm not sure I did it properly. Because I'm still here. And he let me off the contract, and then I left the book for quite a long time, and I picked it up again recently, you know, with HarperCollins, and this is the result. And this book does have a bit of sex and drugs and rock and roll, but, you know, I still think, when I look at it, I think, you know, I didn't do it very well.
Well, one of your associates downstairs was showing me pictures of all of the archives that you had to go through. How much written and also interviews and documentaries, did you go back to all of this to sort of jog your memory a little bit?
The archives were difficult because I had so much stuff. You know, I had a lot of press stuff to go through, a lot of boxes of letters, things that I'd kept, lyrics, and yeah, we put it all in consecutive boxes. And when I got to, let's say, 1973, I would open a box, and sometimes it would be packed solid with stuff, but there were a few years that I kind of went, what's happened in that year? It would be a feather, you know. And, the new romantic era, yeah. But, no, it did enrich the process. It made it fun for me to do the work and to do the writing. Yeah, it did. The fact that I had orderly archives, and that order was only imposed on my archive quite recently. You know, I kept notes, but I kept most of the stuff that I wrote down. So if you imagine that an archive would be simply all of the scratchy lyrics and songs and silly poems that you've written throughout your life and the cassette recordings and stuff like that, all of that gave me, you know, 50 years later, gave me a story. It gave me a timeline. So, you know, although I didn't keep diaries for the whole time at all, you know, and I was also able, I had the benefit of other people researching my life and writing books about my life, who would explain to me, as our esteemed, I'm pretty sure that we have different memories of that first gig at the Fillmore. I think somebody else played there, but that kind of thing. You know, I could go back and look at what other people have written.
The advantage of having both your parents as musicians, you know, I've seen it, and you know, in other musicians as well. But describe your atmosphere, the music that you heard as a kid, and the fact that both of your parents were working musicians, how the effect that it had on you.
Well, there were two different things going on. My dad was the most extraordinary reader. If you're students here, you'll know the difference between being somebody who can work with music on the page, who can write it and arrange it and develop it and respond to it, and those guys who are often fantastic orchestral players who can just read anything you put in front of them. My dad was one of those. You know, I used to dig into his stack of practice materials. Sometimes he used to practice for 2 hours every morning on the clarinet. And he had the most beautiful sound on the clarinet. I never heard the sound again until my son Joseph started. He had a go at playing the clarinet, and he picked up the clarinet and went, boop, and it sounded like my dad. It was just like the same mouth or something. Anyway, my dad could play anything you put in front of him, but my mother was just a sexy singer in the band. That was, when The Who started, we needed a few breaks, and my mum used to call up all of the guys, the powerful guys in the music industry that had wanted to fuck. And And we got some great gigs. And, but what can I say? I just thought the music of that era was so fabulous. It was so romantic, it was so beautiful, you know. Not a particularly big band, but it was a big band, you know, like the kind of Glenn Miller Orchestra. It was an Air Force band with, I think the unique thing about my father's band that was called the Squadronaires was that they had 4, or was it 5? Yeah, they had 5 saxophones. So it was quite a reedy sound that they had. 2 trombones, and a rhythm section. Yeah, that was the lineup. And yeah, just 3 trumpets. So 3 trumpets, 2 trombones, and 5 saxophones. And sometimes maybe a clarinet in that mix. But that was the kind of sound. It was a very, very smooth, romantic sound. And I remember it wasn't just the sound of the band, you know, but as a little kid I was allowed to kind of go and wander out into the audience, and they used to play in these fabulous ballrooms, and one of the stories I tell in the book is I'm sitting, you know, with my vanilla milkshake looking down from up there down at the stage, and my dad's on the stage, and suddenly these 2 young women come and sit either side of me. I'm about 8 or 9 or 10, maybe a bit older, because I kind of knew what was going on. They sit either side of me and they kind of go, "Oh, what a cute little boy." And breasts. Big petticoats and perfume and beautiful hair. And, you know, they used to dress really glamorously to go and dance. And this was the way that people met and got married in that era. And they got bored with me quite quickly, and they looked down at the stage, and one leans across the other and says, "Which one do you want?" And she says, "I'll have that one," and she points at the drummer.
Drummers.
Yeah. I've never really liked drummers since. The other one says, "I'll have that one," and I go, "That's my dad!" So I had 2 lessons. Why drummers are assholes. And why, yeah, and why women are fickle. Because she looked so disappointed when I told her that I was his son. And of course he was off the market, he was taken.
Guitar and banjo, which one came first when you first started playing a stringed instrument?
I got guitar first, but my grandmother, and you'll read in the book that my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, my mother's mother, was not one of my favourite people. I had a very, very hard time with her as a little boy. My mum, for some inexplicable reason, sent me to live with my grandmother, who was just going through the most incredibly difficult time. And she'd been dumped by a rich lover, she'd been cast off to live by the sea, and she was mentally deranged. And my mum and dad split up briefly, and my mother wanted to build a new love with another man, and she sent me to stay with his grandmother. And my grandmother, later, to try to kind of win me back when I was back with my parents many years later, decided that she would be the one to buy me my first guitar. And she found it on the wall of a Greek restaurant. So it was kind of unplayable, but it was unplayable. My dad, though, and my mum used to run a little second-hand shop, you know, a junk shop. They called it an antique shop, but it was a junk shop. And I used to work in there. And occasionally stuff used to come in, and one of the things that people were throwing out a lot of at the time were little banjos, you know, ukulele banjos, mandolin banjos, and I used to, you know, pick these up and play them. So when at school we put together where I first met John Entwistle, he was the trumpet player. John Entwistle, the bass player of The Who, was the trumpet player in a Dixieland, what we call Dixieland jazz band. We call Dixieland all the music of Louis Armstrong, all the early Louis Armstrong stuff. And so I played the banjo. And then later he picked up the bass guitar, and I moved to guitar, and we met Roger Daltrey. And the rest is unbelievably boring history, which you have to listen to every year. He teaches you, and it's all lies.
But they listen, so what am I going to do? I thought it was interesting that where people grow up or where they go to school has a big influence on what happens. And some of it seems to be an amazing amount of coincidences, like being in Ealing at the art college, and you're still in the West London area, and where you grew up is where you met John first, and then Roger later on with the Detours. But at the same time with Ealing Art College and Ealing itself, you've got Alexis Corner and his basement club, which was sort of like the birthplace and an influence to a lot of blues players in the London area. And you just also happen to also work with Jim Marshall, the inventor of the Marshall stack. So it almost seems like Ealing was like this place, this almost a mystical area where so many things came together. I mean, if you look back on that time, it almost seems like a bunch of coincidences.
There were, yeah. There was another extraordinary coincidence, which was that the founder, the roots guy, the real roots guy of English pop music was a guy called Ken Collier, who was a jazz musician. He'd come as a merchant seaman to New Orleans and met Louis Armstrong. And he brought Louis Armstrong's music back to the UK, 1952, 53, 54, quite early. And his band was called the Crane River Band, and the Crane River runs all the way from London Airport all the way through to where I lived in Acton, near that area anyway, through. And so there was that connection too, because Skiffle came out of Ken Collier's band, and Skiffle was the way that the guitar as an accessible instrument was introduced in the UK. Otherwise, you wouldn't have thought of it as being an instrument which kids could play, because it was only played by Scotty Moore, who worked with Elvis, or several guys that worked with Bill Haley, or the guys in the background that worked on sessions with the Everly Brothers, or Ricky Nelson. And those guys are now famous studio musicians. James Burton, Steve Cropper, Leon Russell. You know, those guys were incredibly brilliant. And you would never have thought that you could approach their standard of musicianship or technicality. So, in a sense, that West London scene, then suddenly, when Alexis Corner and Cyril Davis opened the Eeling Club, what happened was that two of the Stones started to play there. Mick Jagger used to get up on stage and do a couple of Jimmy Reed songs. Brian Jones used to play lap steel. And a couple of guys, a guy called Dick Hextall Smith played sax with the Stones in the early days. He would play. And that's how the Stones started. They started in this little basement club right near Ealing Art School. I never saw them, but I used to see them in the street. And I was an art student, and I thought my hair was long, and I used to kind of look at them and think, how do they avoid getting killed, you know? Because although England was fairly liberal, you know, it wasn't that liberal.
It seems like a lot of the bands in the London area realized that to match the Beatles and other sounds from the Liverpool area, they needed to start doing original songs. When you started writing originals, you just plunged right in. What were some of the influences when you were starting your first original music with The Who?
Oh God, yeah.
It seems it was pretty eclectic. It was a combination of
It was
blues people.
very rich. You know, the stuff that I listened to, you know, went over an incredibly broad. You know, I was being exposed to stuff like the movie Jazz on a Summer's Day, which was the first movie about the Newport Jazz Festival, and in that you had Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee, Woody Guthrie. You also had Bill Hall, you know, playing with the Jimmy Guthrie Trio. Jim Hall, sorry, playing with the Jimmy Guthrie Trio. This beautiful song called Train on the River, which I learned straight away. And Chuck Berry. So you had this amazing mix, and that film, I think, came out in 1958. So that was all in my head. But by the time I sat down to write my first song for The Who, hoping for a hit, I'd already heard Bob Dylan. I'd already heard the Beatles, I'd already heard the Stones, but most important of all, I'd already heard the Kinks. And we'd supported them. We'd supported the Kinks at a couple of shows, and I kind of had a feeling they weren't ever going to get the respect that they deserved, and they haven't, apart from with us insiders, because they dressed so strangely. And we, by that time, were dressing like our audience. which turned out to be a great thing to do. Our audience in West London at that time were mainly mods. The mod look then was not dissimilar from the look that I wear today, you know, shirt and suits. You know, most other people were dressing like hippies, you know, long hair and ruffled shirts. And so the Kinks, the first song that I wrote that was a hit was Can't Explain. And we were playing it in a, thank you. We were playing it, although that wasn't the first song I wrote another song that had actually been recorded by a band called The Naturals. So I was already a published songwriter while I was at art college, before The Who really even went professional. And I remember going to a gig and having a deputation come back after the gig, led by a guy called Jack Lyons, and he said, you know, we really want you to write more songs like this. And I said, what do you like about it? And he said, we like to just like it. What do we like about it, to his mates? And they said, you know, we love the fact that it's about, you know, the fact that we can't explain, you know, and we want you to write more songs like this. And I realized actually that I'd been given the most fantastic job that a songwriter can have, which is to be given a commission from a ready-made audience that were not getting the music that they wanted. So the next maybe 30 or 40 songs, and certainly all of Quadrophenia, and lots of work that came subsequently, I wrote with that audience either in front of me or just around the corner or in my mind. In other words, I was writing, they were mainly boys. The deputation that came to see me were 5 boys, I can name them all, and 1 girl who I happily later had sex with. Just 1 girl. And in my book I write, why didn't I marry her? I mean, she was just fantastic, you know. And I thought, well, that's 1. And it was 1 for a very long time, I'm afraid to say. But anyway, so I wrote the song, They Came to See Me, and then I wrote more, in a sense, trying to give that audience what it was that they wanted. And by watching them, just by watching them, you know, when you're a musician on a stage and you're looking down at faces, you know, if you can see those faces, and if you can see the way people are, you know, girls are talking to boys and boys are talking to, and in those days, girls dance with girls and boys dance with boys most of the time. And only towards the very end of the evening would they try and dance with each other. Sometimes fights would break out. You would see the fight beginning to break out. You would know it was coming. You know, you would get this picture of what human life was like and what these guys needed and what it was that they wanted said and sung. I felt I had this unique position on the stage, and that's kind of what I wrote into my thesis as a writer.
You moved off the 3-minute pop song pretty quickly into more conceptual stuff. Like, was a quick one while he's away? It almost seemed like it was a practice run for Tommy and for Quadrophenia later.
Well, yeah, maybe, but yeah, isn't there one before that? I think there's one before that. I had the privilege and wonderment of after a long time not seeing him. Al Cooper was in the green room, and Al Cooper played on The Who's very first so-called rock opera, which was called Rael. I wrote that in 1966, and we didn't record it until much later, but this was, I have the charts for it, not for all of it. I started it and I didn't have time to finish it, but one day Kit Lambert, our manager, and by then record producer, very posh, I will imitate him, came in and said, "So Pete, what have you got now? What have you got going?" And I said, "Well, you know, I haven't got anything, you know, I've got anything." "Yes, but we need something now, we need a record." And I said, "Well, actually, I've, you know, been very busy learning how to orchestrate out of a book." I had a book. It was called Orchestration by Walter Piston. And I'd been listening to opera and studying scores. I had access to a box at Covent Garden. I'd been and seen dozens and dozens of operas. So I was trying to write this proper opera. And the story, I won't tell you the story. I think I've maybe hinted at it in the book. I included it in the book and my editor just said, "Too long, cut it out." It was about a potential war between Red China and Israel, hence Rael. And he said, well, what have you got? And I said, well, I've got this theme, and I've got this theme, and this little song, and this little song. And he got me to compress it all into like a 5 or 6 minute single. And thus went my great opera. I'm very tempted to return to it, but I think it was Wagnerian in ambition. And subsequently, I went on to write A Quick One While He's Away, which came from just as an absurd place. You know, we were doing this album. Kit said, we've got 7 minutes to fill. Have you got some material? And I said, yeah, I've got 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 songs. We can pick a couple and the whole is filled. And he said, we only really want one song. And I said, I didn't know why at the time. He was on some publishing scam. He wanted one song to fill a 7-minute hole. And so I took these 5 or 6 little songs that I had and compressed them together and turned them. And that's really, I think, where I got the sense that there had always been a running narrative. The running narrative was, of course, I can only write from my own experience, but the running narrative was the story of, you know, it's a bit tiresome now, but the boy out there in the crowd. You know, we all shared a very, very similar experience. The post-war experience growing up in West London was so profoundly narrow that we were all very similar.
It's interesting how some of the things in some of your work that have affected it the most seem to come in at the last minute. Like, I was fascinated to see how the whole concept of pinball and Tommy was almost an afterthought when everything else had been finished.
It's not exactly important, is it?
Well, you know, when I talk about that opera in my class, I say, okay, people, what's Tommy about? And they go, deaf, dumb, and blind kid and pinball. Those are the images that stick with most people.
Since then, you know, for all my life, or since '67, I followed an Indian master called Meher Baba, and one of his gags was, you know, God plays marbles with the universe. That's what he says. He said at one point, you will never understand how this works. And so there's a possible, and you know, the artist that did the artwork, Mike McKinney, took some beautiful kind of pinball imagery and spun it into the story. And it does have that kind of, the idea of, you know, atomic, physical balls bouncing about. But I'd written it, we'd recorded it. I got my friend Nick Cohen, who was the youngest music journalist in the UK, writing for a proper serious newspaper, to come and listen to it. And he said, I said to him, so Nick, do you like it? Will you give it a good review? And he said, it's great. He said, but it's, you know, it's all this guru stuff, you know, because Tommy was a kind of a guru who would be overturned by his followers. All this guru stuff, it's also terribly old hat, isn't it? Because we'd had it all in 1966, 67, so I said, oh my God, and I knew that Nick was a obsessive pinball player. So I said, what about? And he said, what you mean, Tommy, instead of just being a deaf, dumb and blind kid who plays the guitar and becomes, you know, a rock messiah, he's actually a pinball champion. He said, in that case, I would give it 3 stars and an extra ball.
So you were thinking fast, basically.
I was thinking fast, yeah. And then I had to go back and write Pinball Wizard, which took me half an hour. And then interpolate is the correct expression, spin pinball back into various other parts, which wasn't as hard as it, but it does mean that you know, it delayed the release of the album. But his review was really important. You know, he did go on to say, Tommy, the greatest album ever made in history. Just because it's got a song about pinball, you know. Well, at least I didn't have to give him $10,000 or something, you know. Which is
In the 70s, when you started working with tracks, I'm always fascinated with footage of Keith Moon with the big headphones on, concentrating like hell, which is such a contrast to, like, you know, footage from the late 60s when he's just like all over the place.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that the way you described it is your rhythm guitar, Keith was orchestral drums, and
That's
John
right,
was lead
yeah.
bass.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't know if that was a new thing for a lot of bands. It was totally opposite from
Well,
what
what was interesting was when I first started to work with rhythm tracks, you know, they were always metronomic. They were pretty much tied to either to the early synthesizers or to chunk sounds that I managed to get, found sounds that I found in old organs and things like that. Or they would be recordings that I'd done against a metronome and then buried the metronome. In those days, if you gave a track with a metronome to a drummer, they wouldn't play it. It wasn't that they couldn't play it, they just wouldn't play it. They say, I'm the guy that decides how. You know, it was about, you know, I've heard that Billy from Green Day talk about this when they go into the studio. The reason that they're tied to using metronome is because the producer wants to chop everything up into bits and moving up, I'll have a bit from there, a bit from there. You know, it's about who's in control. And in those days, the drummer was absolutely in control of the drifting tempo, the mood of the piece. The drummer was the guy who controlled that. Keith just didn't give a damn, you know. You know, I just gave him the track and he played along with it. And I realized, of course, he'd never, ever controlled the time of a track. He just decorated it. So he was good at it. He was really good at it. And that's what gave us the ability to do stuff like Won't Get Fooled Again and Barbara O'Reilly, and subsequently a couple of the tracks on Quadrophenia were done to clicks as well. And of course now everybody works to clicks. I'm not saying we invented it, but you know, at all, because I'm sure other people have done it too. But Keith was very good at it.
We're going to be getting to the questions from the audience in about 2 minutes, but I'm going to read you a question from our Director of Communications, Matt Skelly, who's sitting there in the fourth row. It started off as
Better be good.
Well, it started off as about 3 paragraphs, so we had to pare it down a little bit. So here we go. To many people, you're viewed as a poet laureate of youth and identity, exploring themes about creation, destruction, individuality, and search for enlightenment in meaning. In your book, paragraph 2, however, you attribute these themes largely to the profound impact of growing up in England after World War II. Do you think that the post-war atmosphere amplified these perennial human questions with you and your contemporaries?
I think that's what the entire book is really about, the serious stuff. That's really what I wanted to address, was that the post-war, you know, what's not just interesting about the fact that, you know, I've heard Keith Richards say the same thing. We grew up in bomb buildings, you know, we would go through these bomb buildings and we would find watches, and I can remember once one of my friends finding a human bone. You know, we were 4 years old and we were playing in bomb sites. And, but when that music that we started to produce in the 63, 64, 65 to address the fact that the boys that were coming to see the band felt very disenfranchised because, you know, you weren't needed, you weren't given guns to go and shoot Germans. I'm sorry if there are any Germans here, but you weren't asked to do anything for your country, for your queen, for your parents. You were just asked to shut up. There's peace. We've got sugar. What more do you want? Then suddenly, this music lands in America, and guess what? For some reason, you guys had exactly the same stuff going on, but it wasn't quite so clearly delineated. You know, the only bomb experience that you had was Pearl Harbor, which was incredibly traumatic and led to the much bigger bomb that followed, which ended the war and changed civilization as we know it, and caused all of the neuroses that I suffered when I was 11, 11, 12 years old, when I thought that there was no future. However, when we first brought our music to America in 1967, we found that young people in America had exactly the same problem. They were disenfranchised. You know, that for them too, there was no need for them to join the military. There was no great drive for them to join the military. The military was being reduced. The Navy was being reduced. Everything was, you know, being computerized. You know, what we were going to be doing from then on, it was all going to be push-button warfare, and it would all be over in a heartbeat. And I think it was fascinating that the post-war syndrome, which was so acute for me as a child in the UK, would resonate in America too. There's no question about that. You know, the other thing is that some of the deeper, darker things behind A Quick One While He's Away, which is obviously about some child somewhere being hurt, which I now think could have been me. But in Tommy, where you've got a child who's being experimented with, you know, used as a tool in a family that's suffering from, you know, a post-war breakup, that resonated with so many young American kids. So, you know, I'm not sure that everything was particularly in order here either. You know, and then you suddenly think, well, why would it be? Because you guys fought too. You know, you guys may have fought in a different landscape, but you fought, you know, and so a lot of those men didn't come back. You know, 5 million people were killed in the First World War, but, you know, maybe 1 million American soldiers died, you know, in the last few years of that fighting. I don't know what the statistic is, but however many it was, these are guys that did not come back. And as a result of that, we enjoyed peace. But the devastation that causes, I'm not trying to get too deep here or dark. You just have to look at this, you know, with your eyes wide open. This fucking changed things hugely. Changed things hugely. It's like now if you meet somebody who worked around, you know, maybe on the site of 9/11. You know, there were a bunch there yesterday, guys that were at 9/11. And at the thing before, there were a couple of people that, you know, that had been there, you know, working on the site. They'd changed forever. And they come and see me simply because The Who played at the 9/11 concert and did a good job, but we just happened to be there. But I think that, thank you. So the post-war thing that I stumbled on, which was, I didn't want to make anything of it. I just thought, hey, this is an audience that haven't got any music. I can give it to them. I can give them something. People try to put us down. That's as far as it went. You know, it was just, you know, we have nothing. We're disenfranchised.
We're going to get to the point now where we're going to have a few questions from the audience, and we're going to have at least get to 3 of them, and we'll see how things go. We have to sort of check about the time, but we've got a couple of ushers down on the front, and we have one up top. There's no way we're going to get to everyone, but we're going to try to get to people here and there. I want to start on this side of the room. Who's usher on this side? Stand up and be noticed.
Oh my God, you're all so young.
This gentleman standing up back there, we'll go with him. Yep, right back.
Hey Pete, thank you very much. This has been amazing. 2 very quick yes or no questions. One, you've had a really busy week with tons of press. I was wondering if tonight you might play a song that you haven't played all week. And my second question is, I've got a Gibson SG right here. Would you like to sign it and or smash it?
The answer to both those questions is no. Good stuff.
Person right there behind you, yep.
Hey Pete, I'm a young musician, so I figured I'd ask something about that. What's been your A, biggest attribute, and B, biggest detriment as a musician?
As a musician, I think my best thing is that I can hear good stuff all the time. I'm not always able to put it down, but I hear it all the time. When I was really young, I used to hear music all the time, just all the time. And I think maybe it's probably a mental illness of some kind. Like maybe, no, I'm serious. Maybe a early form of bipolar disease, schizophrenia or whatever. But I don't hear it the way I did. So I can always kind of, there's always a stuff going on that I can dip into. My main detriment is that I believe art is finishing things, just that, finishing things. It's easy to start stuff. It's really difficult to say, that's done. My biggest detriment is that I've got lots of lyrics that I think would make very, very cool songs and lots of bits of music, and to bring those two things together and just say, that's done, and play it to somebody, that's the hardest thing in the world, and I think every artist has trouble with that. So that's my biggest detriment. Thank you.
Up in the cheap seats.
Hi, Pete. My name's Pete too. I was gonna get big on and wonder if the Who really did, right here, if the Who really did raise Britain out of its decadent ambient state in the 60s and 70s, but I'll tone it down a bit. I know that you were a little critical of Keith Richards' book. Not much, but a little bit, and that he didn't get enough into the studio stuff and what went on in the studio. I think I read that somewhere, Rolling Stone or something. And so I'm just wondering, just something I've been wondering about is, you will mostly have had the rest of the band follow you in the Who in terms of making a Who song. But in terms of John Entwistle's songs, let's just say, who may be the person that you played guitar for the most in terms of somebody else that wrote music, maybe not, but I'm thinking so. Did you, how was that relationship, you know, in terms of how you, worked with him and played his music? And because what I hear in his songs is mostly heavy bass, and I try to listen for the creative guitar elements. So I'm just wondering maybe how that type of relationship went on in the studio, and maybe the rest of the band.
It sounds like a criticism in a sense, I think, what you're saying, and you may be right. Maybe I was unable to contribute as much as I could to John's writing. I don't know. But what I like to say is that John and I started so young, and I had already written a couple of songs, and I gave him the rig that I used to write songs on, and he wrote his first couple of songs on that rig. And I remember one of the things that he loved about writing songs was what I loved about it was that he could do everything. You know, he could do all of the stuff. So his demos for his songs, his compositions, the score that I used were his demos, didn't have guitar. They only had bass. They would sometimes have keyboard, piano, and they would have brass. So there was no guitar part. And often when I went into the studio to work with him, he was very, very quick. He would give me a chord chart, and I felt like a session musician. I'd just play the chords. And they never fell under my fingers, his songs, ever. Maybe Heaven and Hell is an exception. That was a song that we played often to open our show. But most of the time I did. Keith Richards said something very interesting in his New York Public Library talk. He said that he's never been able to do anything creative on his own. I'm quite the opposite. I find it very difficult to do creative work with somebody else. That wasn't a problem for John and I don't think. John was always very keen on loved what I wrote. I loved what he wrote. Where it was a problem, actually, funny enough, was for Roger and I, because if Roger and I had ever been able to write songs together, I think the band would have been much better balanced, in a sense, particularly in its early days. A lot of the conflict at the beginning was because I was the one that spoke for the band, but Roger had to say what it was that I said, and he had his own story and his own feelings about music.
And you two have a still enduring relationship and going out on tour soon. It seems, from what I read, that he gave up guitar playing, he gave up songwriting. It seems like he had a focus on what he wanted to do once he sort of freed himself from that.
Yeah, I think that's right. We were a band, we had a singer, and he was the lead guitar player. We had a handsome singer. Hey, just wear a suit and, do Elvis Presley songs and Cliff Richard songs and stuff, and there would be girls in the audience going, "Oh, look, isn't he handsome?" And Roger would be standing bow-legged with the guitar. And I was the rhythm guitar player. And you know what's crazy? My hero in those days was a guy called Bruce Welch, who was the rhythm player for the Shadows. And I always thought he was such a perfect rhythm player. He never added anything that you didn't really... And he lives right in my neighborhood, and I see him every other day. We'd eat in the same restaurant, and sometimes we'd be having lunch together, and he'll turn to me. He's about 4 or 5 years older than me, and he'll say, "Pete, how do you play solos?" All this time. And I say to him, "Listen, you, man, you don't have to. You invented. It's like, like the Everly Brothers, like Eddie Cochran. These guys were rhythm players. Wow, these guys invented that rhythmic style that I love so much these days. And okay, so many. Look at YouTube. There are kids on there that can play 3 guitars at once faster than I can play one. So you know, it's dexterity and virtuosity is a place you can go if you work very, very, very hard at it. But in so doing, you might lose some stuff as well. It depends what you want to do. Do you want to, do you want to play, the most complex orchestral work? Do you want to play jazz? Do you want to set yourself free? And all I really wanted to do was to strum away. Roger wanted to be the guy that the girls were looking at. And he pulled it off. It took him a long time, I have to say. No, it did. It did take him a long time.
The difference in his sound and everyone's sound between like 66 and say into the 70s, it's almost like everyone found their resonance. Roger found his resonance as he went into the 70s. His voice became more powerful.
I think he found his resonance with Tommy. I tell the story about, Roger used to sing like a blues singer, like a black guy, particularly like Howling Wolf or somebody like that. Deep growling voice. He used to love pretending to be Johnny Cash, and he's got a deep, resonant voice. And so when I wrote Tommy, and there was see me, feel me, touch me, I wrote it knowing full well that hey, I've got a part here. This is something he's never going to be able to do. After about 3 or 4 weeks recording, I go into the studio, and as I'm walking up, I hear, see me. The arsehole had managed to do it.
He knew how big it was going to be.
But it also just catapulted him because it gave him another piston. It gave him another.
Have you heard from some of your friends since the book has come out?
Oh my God.
Has Mick called you again?
The Mick thing's a joke. Why do you Americans are so cool?
I don't know what you're talking about. I was talking about that other thing.
Oh, yeah.
No, have you heard from friends, family?
You know what I've heard from is people kind of look at the index and they kind of call me up and they say, where am I? You told me you loved me. Twice. No, I'm kidding. No, I am really kidding. No, I've had a few friends who I've upset. And I think I have to say that I think it's the editing process that does that. I wrote about 1,200 pages. It had to be cut to 400. They gave me 500. And in so doing, when you start to slash and burn, I call it, because I did this as an editor at Faber for many years myself, cutting other people's work, and they hate you for it. Even though the book might be more readable. I think I've got a more readable book now, but I think some of the storytelling and some of the stuff that's been cut out, I don't think you would be interested in reading it in isolation, but it does sometimes add weight to some of the stories. So, what's been interesting, if any of you guys have seen me on morning show TV, they ask the same questions over and over and over again, and they get them from inside the lab. They think, well, shall we read this book? No, let's not read the book.
Let's just go for the index.
So, hey, Keith Moon jumped off a hotel balcony into a pool and nearly died. You're partially deaf in your left ear. You stole your windmill guitar from Keith Richards, yeah? How was it to help rescue Eric Clapton from heroin? So Mick Jagger is the only man that you've ever wanted to fuck. Oh. And then you realise actually that what you're doing is you're selling books. And you're not really selling the truth. The truth is in there, but the rest of it is not really about that. And I think what I want to say here, and it's thank you for interrogating me so brutally.
My pleasure.
It's just that that when I sat down to write the book, what I realised, which is very different to everything else that I do. When I do a TV show, I want to make people laugh. I'm entertaining. There's a bit of that going on now, as I'm sure you can guess. When I sat to write the book, there was none of that going on. I just wanted what went in there to be stuff that I wouldn't pick up in 20 years' time and think, what the hell was I saying? You know, that's just a lie, or that's gilding the lily, or that's not what happened, or why did you say that when it's not true, or you're showing off. I just wanted it to be true. And some people have said, a guy that I spoke to, for one of the first interviews I did back in London, said, this is the only autobiography I've come across in my entire life that I would describe as a hatchet job. You know, it's because I'm being honest, you know, and I think if any of you guys wrote down your life really truthfully, there would be good stuff and there would be bad stuff. People just don't expect you to talk about the bad stuff. They just think you're going to masturbate away at how fucking cool you are. So, in a way, and you know what the Who have been, the way that we've connected with our audience over the years, I think is because of the fact that we've allowed our vulnerabilities to come forward. You know, for heaven's sake, two of our greatest guys in the band have died out of careless drug-related slips. You know, this happens to us. This happens to our people, our friends. We know people that do this. And it seems to be endemic in not just in the music industry, but in all of the show business related industries. And at least now we can see it coming sometimes and we can prevent it happening.
My favorite quote is the very simple, just play. Would you like to play for us right now?
Thank you. I've been asked to play something that I haven't played this week. But what I might do is play something that I've never ever played before in my life. Thank you. There are men high up there fishing. I haven't seen quite enough of the world. I ain't seen a sign of my hero, and I'm still diving down for pearls. Let me flow into the ocean. Let me get back to the sea. Let me be stormy and let me be calm. Let the tide in. I wanted to rush over me. I'm flowing on the bridges. I'm flying through the sky. I am not the actor. This can't be the same. But I'm in the water as far as I can see. Remembering distant memories, recalling other names. I'm rippling over the canyon and I'm falling in the train. Let me flow into the ocean, let me get back to the sea. Let me be stormy, let me be calm. At the time I wanted to rush over me. 'Cause you know I wanna drown. You know I wanna drown. I wanna drown in your sweet, sweet love. I wanna drown in your sweet, sweet love. I wanna drown in it, drown in it, drown, drown in it, drown, drown in it, drown, drown, drown. I wanna drown in your sweet, sweet love. Wanna drown in your sweet, sweet love. I wanna drown in it, drown, 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 drown. I wanna drown in your sweet, sweet love. Wanna drown in your sweet, sweet love tonight. If your child ain't all he should be now, this girl will put him right. I'll show him what he could be now. Just give me one night. I'm the gypsy, the acid queen. Pay me before I start. I'm the gypsy, the acid queen. Ow! Tear his soul apart. Give us a room and close the door. Leave us for a while. Your boy won't be a boy no more. Young but not a child. I'm a gypsy, the acid queen. Pay me before I start. I'm the gypsy. I'm guaranteed to tear your soul apart. Gather your wits and hold on fast. Your mind must learn to roam, just as the gypsy queen must do. You gotta hit the road. My work is done now, look at him. He's never been more alive. His head it shakes, his fingers clutch. Watch his body ride. I'm the gypsy, the acid queen. Pay me before I start. I'm the gypsy, I'm guaranteed to break his little heart. Every year is the same. I feel it again. I'm a loser, no chance to win. Leaves start falling and the come down is calling. Loneliness starts sinking in. But I'm one. I am one. And I can't see that this is me. I will be. You'll all see I'm the one. Where do you get those blue, blue jeans? Faded, that secret so tight. Where do you get that walk on so lean? Your shoes and your shirts are just right. But I'm one. I'm one, yes I am. And I can't see that this is me. And I will be, you'd all see I'm the one. I got a Gibson without a case, but I can't get that even-tan look on my face. Ill-fitting clothes, I just blend in the crowd. Fingers so clumsy, voice too loud, but I'm one. See, this is me. I will be. You'll all see I'm the one. I'm the one. I'm the one. Yeah. Whenever I do that, I'm tempted to close again. I'm the one, yeah. No, you're not, Jimmy. You're A1. I'm not doing, what do they call them? Requests. You know what all those songs sound like? Tattoo. Mary Ann with a shaky thing in the ball. I'm going to do Won't Get Fooled Again, and I'm going to do it slow. We'll be fighting in the streets with our children at our feet, and the morals that they worship will be gone. Men who spurred us on sit in judgment now of our wrong. They decide and they shut sings the song. I tip my hat to the new Constitution, take a bow for the new revolution, smiling grin to change all around, pick up my guitar and play, just like yesterday. Then I'll get on my knees and I'll pray. We don't get fooled again. Change it had to come. We knew it all along. We were liberated from the foe. That's all. And the world was just the same. History ain't changed. And the banners, they were all thrown in the last war. My hat to the new Constitution, take a bow to the new revolution, smiling grin, change all around, pick up my guitar and play, just like yesterday, and I'll get on my knees and I'll pray. We don't get fooled again. If we happen to be left half alive, get on our papers and I'll smile at the sky, for I know that the hypnotized never lie. Nothing in the streets looks any different to me. Slogans are replaced by the buy, and the party on the left is now party on the right, and the beards have all grown longer overnight. To the new Constitution, take a bow for the new revolution, smiling grin, change all around, pick up my guitar and play, just like yesterday. Then I'll get on my knees and I'll pray. Let my love open the door. Let my love open the door. Let my love open the door to your heart. Make a new boss, just the same as the old boss. Imagine this. The bouncing boy.
Pete Townshend, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. Hope you had a great time. Thank you, and good night.